Hello, and welcome to this ethical dilemma in science. We're going to take a look at managing forest fires to promote safety, biodiversity, and ecological balance, and basically ask the question to burn or not to burn. Now, the impetus for this ethical dilemma in science, I actually started working on this during the summer of 2021, but then put it aside, so we're back to it now. Recording this the third week of April 2022, just looking at the news simply from the last couple days. We've got a wildfire burning up here in Alaska, extending out over 4,000 acres. We're looking at a wildfire in New Mexico, a wildfire over here very near to Prescott, Arizona. And it's just the start of what expects to be a fairly long and fairly severe forest fire season, as we go into kind of the summer months, especially when we're dealing with kind of warmer temperatures throughout that region and associated with a very extended drought period. We're looking at a lack of rain in some areas of the American West that are, at century, worst in a century, if not longer. All of this kind of gives rise to this report over here that came out in The Guardian. I'm actually recording this on April 19th. So it came out today, where they're basically talking about the fact that the wildfire smoke is getting up and getting into the atmosphere and potentially impacting on many of the efforts to reduce carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And so this is, potentially a big problem, whether or not we're talking about just simply the effects on the environment, whether we're talking about the ecosystem, where we're looking at kind of loss of habitats where organisms are going to be living, or potential loss and economic impact on human beings that may be living in the region. We're looking at, I think it was one of these, the Prescott fire in Arizona. They're looking at a number of people being evacuated. If we take a look at the forest fires that were going on in California and the American West last year, huge fires resulting in excessive property damage and sadly a lot of human deaths, as well as economic impact as well. And if we take a look at this, the kind of severity of these forest fires, it seems to be getting worse, and statistically, it is getting worse. According to a report from the organization in California's government looking at fires, they are reporting that they reported the top 20 fires. I've cut that down to the top 7. Six of the largest wildfires in California occurred within a 1-year period from August 2020 to August 2021. And so if this is a pattern that is continuing, this could only be worse for those living out in the American West. And as the drought and higher temperatures continue to rise, potentially much expanded a risk of forest fires as we're going through. Now, this just isn't an American problem. This isn't just a problem in North America. Again, these are slides from or news reports from 2020, 2021. We're looking at last summer 2021, fires in the Mediterranean region, very, very severe, making the international news for what I think is the first time, at least at the level that it's being reported. Siberia had a massive forest fire, seeing it here within the news report. Actually, this forest fire resulted in smoke extending all the way up to the North Pole, and it's thought that this was the first time that's occurred. Also occurring in the southern hemisphere, Brazil. I think this is a 2020 report. Massive wildfires going on, destroying large regions of the Amazonian rainforest, and that pattern was continued. Right immediately before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were incredibly devastating fires in regions of Australia, destroying the environment, destroying the not the environment, just impacting in the environment, destroying the ecosystem. And it's actually, I was reading a report last night, thought to have caused extinction of some species, and they're actually in the process of reintroducing some highly endangered species which lost their habitat during the fires, and their hope to be able to restore those species going forward. So when we take a look at fires, forest fires in general, but taking a look at fires, basically we're looking at kind of a very destructive force within nature. It can occur through natural causes. So, if you've got a dry region and you've got a thunderstorm coming through, you got lightning that would be impacting on the ground. The lightning has the potential to, strike a tree or, strike the ground and ignite combustible material. And that combustible material could be anything from dry plant matter, so dry leaves, dry grasses, again, because we're looking at a period of a drought, or, if it's striking a dead tree, that could potentially ignite the tree as well. Still, there are a lot of human-caused accidents that can cause the generation of a forest fire. Basically, all you need is an ignition source. So something like a cigarette just flung out a window while it's still kind of smoldering. If that lands in an area where there is something that is combustible, dry grass, dry leaves, something like that, there's a risk that that would ignite and spread. Just simple campfires. If you go into national park systems, they will often, or I think always, have, what is the wildfire risk that day? And if it's hot and dry and windy, there are restrictions on whether or not you can have campfires present, again, because of the risk associated with it. Sadly, there is another cause for these fires that we're seeing, and that is cases of arson, where we've seen people intentionally starting it, sometimes maliciously, sometimes just through errant activity. But again, that is a huge risk associated with it. When we talk about forest fires within the United States, at least in my mind, I thought about Smokey the Bear. Smokey the Bear is a spokesbear for the National Park Service, created in 1944, I think August of 1944, to promote kind of responsible stewardship within the forest, to be able to go into the national park system, to be able to enjoy nature, but without causing a big impact by causing a wildfire to occur. And as he said, only you can prevent forest fires, except for the lightning stuff and things like that. But we need to kind of intentionally think about what we're doing. If we take a look at what's needed to have a fire, and this is a fire in general, not just a forest fire, we need some type of fuel. And so in a forest type setting, a natural setting, that fuel is going to be combustible material normally associated with maybe dry branches, dry grass, leaves that have fallen down, that again are very, very dry and associated with a drought. Under normal circumstances, that would break down over a period of time, and the materials within that leaf matter, plant matter, grass matter, whatever that would be, would then go back into the soil and refresh the soil and provide nutrients to the soil. But there are times when this will build up in a place, and so we would have like an accumulation of brush that is highly combustible. We need the presence of oxygen. Make sure I'm on the right slide. Oxygen here basically because the flames need oxygen to burn. And so the combination of the fuel and the oxygen is going to generate a lot of heat. It's going to cause that fire to spread. And basically you end up with this kind of positive feedback reaction, which probably more technical than I should go into this, but basically almost like an explosive reaction. We get greater heat, which corresponds to more fuel burning and taking in oxygen, generating more heat, more burning, more heat, more burning, more heat, more burning, just basically kind of continuing that cycle. And in doing that, causing the fire to spread. And so what we need to do, and basically look at this as a triangle. You need all three components in order to have the fire going on and the fire potentially spreading. And so, if you can remove the fuel and you just have oxygen and heat, you're going to be fine. You could smother the fuel, get rid of the oxygen. Potentially that would, put out the fire as well. A little bit harder, but if you could remove the heat component of that as well, there's the potential that the fuel would not combust. If it's getting to the point where it's likely to catch on fire, cooling that may be sufficient. But again, that's something that's really hard to do kind of in a natural setting. So if we're taking a look at forest fires as the theme for today, what we can see is there have been lots of efforts to control kind of these wildfires that are out in kind of natural areas. First is in an effort to smother using flame retardant or water. And so thinking about the three legs of a fire, the smothering of that would be to remove oxygen. So basically prevent the fuel from getting access to oxygen and burning. So in this slide, slides from the USDA Forest Service, we've got an airplane here dropping in a fire retardant, which again hopefully is going to smother the flames below it. In a more localized region, we've got a helicopter here that's kind of dipping down into kind of a lake, probably a lake. I don't see a lot of movement going on here. Dipping down into a lake, they've got a bucket there. They're going to pull up that bucket and then kind of fly over area and drop that water onto the surface in an effort to kind of quench the fire, to smother the fire and remove the oxygen. And potentially moisten it and kind of make it less combustible, if we think about that way. In some cases, where you have a forest fire close to a developed region, it is possible to take fire trucks into that region. But again, that is dependent upon having ready access to a road, because fire trucks tend to be heavy in areas where you've got these fires going on. It's very disruptive and difficult to get into that area, and so oftentimes it's not possible to get fire trucks into those areas. Another way of treating forest fires, either ahead of time or during the fire, is an effort to remove the fuel, remove the material that would be combustible through the use of prescribed or controlled burns. And so what we've got here, again, probably a National Park Service worker here kind of going through. He's got this device here, which is kind of the equivalent of a little flamethrower, and is basically going to cause the generation of kind of small, and as it says, controlled burns. A small amount of burn here will establish a fire break. And in doing that fire break, you've got an area without fuel, and without access to the fuel, that flame is going to get to that region and potentially burn out. Now, if it's very windy, potentially the flame could jump over that burn, and we've seen that occur in some of the wildfires in the American West before that they thought they had contained, and because of the high winds in the area, it was able to escape containment. If we take a look at the diagram over here, and this is from the Florida State Department of, I think, Agriculture or Forest Service. I can't remember the abbreviations from it. But basically, you have a situation here where they're going through and clearing up the underbrush, clearing up the availability of the fuel that is going to be present in an area. And so we're looking at this. The wind is going to be flowing from left to right across this slide. And so they start with a natural break over here. So they've got a pond or a lake or a river, which again, if it's not too windy, as the flames get to this point, they're not going to be able to jump over the water and get and start a fire on the other side. And so basically you start the fire in this region, and it's going to start to burn kind of back here. But because the wind is blowing in that direction, that flame and the fire is going to spread upwind very, very slowly. Once you've got a decent break over here, and then you can go over at this end and start some small fires. And those fires, again, driven by the wind, are going to blow in that direction. And you can control kind of at this point here, kind of the advancement. And so you may, kind of go in, smother it, maybe have, I think they've got here, let's see what that says here. It's a brush truck equipped with foam. And so it's a vehicle designed, not like fire trucks that were designed for highways and paved roads, but a brush truck would be more of a four-wheel drive vehicle with a heavy-duty suspension to be able to drive into these regions. They've got foam present, so if this starts to spread a little bit further, they have the ability to smother that flame out. And again, minimize the impact of the flame that is prescribed, the controlled burn that they're doing, in an effort to kind of clear it away and minimize the risk for a wildfire going forward. And then finally, it is possible that when you have a wildfire, we've got smoke jumpers here, whole variety of names, basically, firemen that put their lives at risk going into regions where you have a wildfire going, and they try to get it under control. And again, sadly, every year it seems that there are a number of firefighters that get trapped within the flames. They have equipment that allows them, under some circumstances, to be able to protect themselves, flame retardant. They kind of dig into a position, allow the flames to go over them. But again, sadly, we have seen the loss of life of some of these firefighters. But again, they're doing the same basic thing that we would be looking at kind of at a bigger scale, using the controlled burns, the prescribed burns, looking at smothering the fires with helicopters, with buckets, or airplanes with flame retardant. They're going through potentially putting the flame out, using a little bit of water here, so they're probably close to a road, smothering it here, digging it out, eliminating the fuel source, doing the same thing here, digging, trying to kind of get rid of the combustible material and prevent the flame from spreading kind of over this region. Now, when we think about fire, we often think about the destructive forces of fire. The damage that occurs, the loss of life that could potentially be happening associated with a fire. But still, fire is a natural occurrence, and fire has a natural place within a habitat, within an ecosystem. And what we can see is that fire can revitalize a stagnant or diseased ecosystem. And so looking at an artist's renditions here, we've got an established kind of forest region here. We have a flame go through, so you can see the flames burning, it burns through, and basically wipes the slate clean. You get this kind of bare region here. But relatively quickly, that barren region is going to be repopulated. It's going to grow down here, and you're going to have dry ground over here. So you're going to have grasses and maybe some small bushes kind of developing here. You'll see plants and animals kind of going into that area that are going to be similar to what you'd see kind of in a grassy area. Over time, again, without any further disturbances, you're going to start to see kind of small trees start to grow up within the grassland areas. With further time, again, you can see some fast-growing trees that are going to be present. These slower-growing trees are going to be a little bit behind them in terms of their own growth. But over time, again, without further disturbances, those slower-growing trees are going to kind of reestablish that original forest that we've got here. And again, that natural process of succession is something that you would see, occurring naturally and normally within a region. And to be honest, on a somewhat periodic schedule. And so it's thought that these forests don't last forever. They're going to get to a point where they have old age, or start to look at a lot of storm damage, wind damage, tearing branches out of the trees, maybe trees that have been weakened through disease, kind of falling down. May have an area where it's infested with insects as a pest that's gone through and kind of devastated that area. A fire can go through and, like I said, wipe the slate clean, and we can have the reestablishment of kind of a normal, kind of healthy forest that's able to grow into that area. Now, again, there are limits to this, and again, kind of widespread, huge forest fires are going to result in large areas of devastation. They're still going to recover, but they may take a greater time to recover because of the extent of the damage. And now it's easy to take a look at these artist renditions of a succession, but this is an example of a park in Canada. I think it's actually in Toronto, the High Park Nature Preserve. And you can see an area here that we start out with, looking a little desolate, probably a lot of debris. We got to see some leaf litter kind of accumulating here, maybe some dead branches and things like that down there. So we've got fuel that is down on the ground that would be at risk for, a fire going through. And so they did a controlled burn in that area. They described it as prescribed burn, but prescribed burns and controlled burns are essentially the same thing. And so you can see it burned through the area, kind of cleared up the dead branches, the dead twigs, and maybe dead plants in here, cleaned up the leaf litter that was present. But then again, as long as that fire isn't too out of control, isn't too hot, many times the trees that are in that present are going to be protected. They're going to have the bark around them. They're relatively resilient. And so, a fire burning on the ground oftentimes is not going to cause damage to the trees. It often, only gets a risk to the tree if that fire gets up into the canopy and really burns through the leaves and the branches where the plant is doing photosynthesis, where the plant, is basically kind of generating the nutrients that it needs with its leaves. So if we take a look at this, again, a succession pattern over a period of about 8 weeks, we can see that we've got that desolated area kind of through here. But even within 2 weeks, we're starting to see grasses starting to appear. Grasses are starting to kind of grow out a little bit more. And so as we're going through here, we can see kind of the recovery of grasses and starting to see kind of smaller brush appearing. Once this is occurring, that's kind of a natural succession pattern that will be there. We will see animals migrating into this region and repopulating it. And then over a period of time, this will continue to develop. Now, when we take a look at wildfires, again, we often think about the devastating destruction that is associated with it. But fires in a natural environment, and I'm making a transition intentionally from a forest fire, from a wildfire that is basically out of control and causing large regions of destruction, with what is referred to as a wildland fire. And so wildfires out of control are different from periodic wildland fires, which are there for kind of renewal of the region. You have burning of dead organic material, which will often return nutrients to the soil. It will open up dense regions where you may have, not a lot of sunlight reaching the ground, and therefore, small plants, seedlings aren't going to be able to survive because they don't have access to sunlight. And so basically, you've got all of these tall trees and basically nothing underneath. When we have these wildland fires go through, again, they're going to clear an area, and in clearing that area, make it available for organisms that need to be in that area to live. So a couple examples of this. This is, make sure I get my notes right. This is a endangered Karner blue butterfly. And so when it's an endangered butterfly, but its caterpillars will only feed on these wild lupine flowers here. But these flowers only grow in periodically disturbed areas. And so basically what happens is a region of fire will go through, eliminate the competition for the wild lupine, open up the canopy a little bit so these plants can get access to sunlight. These things are going to grow relatively quickly. And what we'll see is that make sure I get the name right, Karner blue butterfly, caterpillars will feed upon that. There have been some studies that have been done in areas where they've suppressed forest fires, suppressed these wildland fires. And what they saw is in areas where we didn't have those periodic fires occurring, there was much less of this wild lupine. And because there was less of the wild lupine, we actually saw a decline in the Karner blue butterflies. And so again, showing the importance of these wildland fires. Another example of this over here, we can see in this case, this is I think a jack pine or a logpole pine, but they have what are referred to as serratinous cones. Basically, if you take a look at these pine cones here, they're sealed with wax. They've got this waxy resin that is going to be covering them up. And only when a fire kind of goes through that area will that wax melt and allow for the seeds that are present here to be released, land on the ground, and start to sprout. And again, from a certain kind of ecological standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes sense. If you've got an area where you haven't had a wildfire go through or a wildland fire go through relatively recently, it's going to be really hard for new seedlings to grow. And so these plants are going to be generating, offspring, seeds to, create the offspring. They're going to grow from these seeds. Um, but if the ground's not clear, if the canopy isn't open, they're not going to survive. And so having those things there, they're stored up and they're ready to go when the ground is cleared and ready for them to sprout. And then finally, this is a red-cockaded woodpecker that lives in a mature pine forest that's maintained by fire. So again, necessity, it needs to have these wildland fires go through in order to maintain the habitat of this woodpecker. So I've actually got a couple options for prompts for the ethical dilemma in science. The first is, how should we manage lands responsibly to minimize fire risk? And so think about this. What would be a wildland fire policy or a wildfire policy? In the past, we've seen a lot of suppression of these wildland fires, these natural periodic fires. And there was a thought that that would result in a buildup of the debris and brush, so that when you get a fire that's then established within that region, they tend to be more severe and spread more quickly and be harder to control because they have a ready source of fuel available to them. And so, the question is, how do we control that, possibly by allowing some of these natural wildland fires to burn under, controlled conditions, possibly to keep them limited, but allowing for that natural progression to occur. So what should be the goals of a program like that? Who should be at the table? We could be looking at public laws, potentially executive orders, or, something like in this case here, we're looking at the U.S. Department of the Interior Office of Wildland Fires coming up with a wildland fire policy. So, what would the goals be for a responsible land management associated with fire risk? Should the goal be solely to protect human life? Should it be to protect animal life? Should it be to minimize property damage in areas that are built up? Come back in this one in a second, but should we respect the indigenous culture of that area? They've been living on the land for hundreds, if not thousands, of years, and they have they have a connection to the land that has been passed down to them from their ancestors. If we take a look at the effects of a fire, if you have a fire go through that region, you would potentially have a disruption of the water quality as ash and with severe flooding and erosion because of the loss of plant life that holds the ground in place. You could have severe flooding and erosion, and again, damaging to the water quality that is going to be available. Now, I mentioned the importance of respecting the indigenous culture. And so what we've seen in recent years is a lot of studies that have recognized the connection with the indigenous peoples to their land. And that connection comes through their cultural and historical knowledge that has been passed down to them. And so we need to make sure that we recognize and acknowledge and understand their stewardship of these natural lands. And so a number of studies have been able to come out in recent years that have shown that the indigenous populations are very, very good at managing their lands for promoting biodiversity, for promoting kind of a sustainable kind of stewardship. And so where'd the paper go? This conservation of Earth's biodiversity is embedded in Indigenous fire stewardship. And I'll link this article in the notes down below. This paper kind of highlights a quote, and I might read this directly, but it basically says that indigenous peoples comprise only 5% of the world's population, but protect 85% of the world's biodiversity through stewardship of indigenous managed lands. And so, it's not only found in these indigenous areas, but they've got a huge amount of biodiversity that is present in their areas. So they got to be doing something right. And so we need to respect that, and we need to learn from that because, again, they have a connection to the lands that has been coming from a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and so you know us as scientists, we need to be able to listen to them because they understand and can listen to the land in ways that we can't with our scientific instruments. So there's a lot that we can learn from them. The second ethical dilemma in science question that you could consider: should homeowners in high fire risk areas be required to obtain insurance similar to what homeowners in floodplains do? There's floodplain insurance. And so if we take a look at this, and these are statistics through 2019, the estimated number of properties at high to extreme wildfire risk: over 2 million properties in California, over 700,000 in Texas, and lower numbers through Arizona, Idaho, and Washington, and it kind of drops down from there. But we're talking about a huge potential impact, huge economic impact, huge personal impact. If you've talked to people that have lost, just simply losing their homes to a fire, it is devastating. And so, what do we need to do to try to protect those individuals? Now, some states, some municipalities are going through. So this again, April 2022, Oregon is working on a wildfire risk map right now. They hope to publish this in early summer of 2022. Where they're basically going to be recommending that homeowners in specific areas take specific precautions to minimize their fire risk. And so examples of that from the Insurance Institute, and so that the kind of organization that kind of gives advice to insurance companies, basically says that homeowners or developers in areas of high fire risk should be thinking about using non-combustible siding, decking, and roofing materials. So materials that are unlikely to catch fire under normal circumstances. Now, under some circumstances, high heat, high winds, high flames, pretty much anything becomes combustible that you would be using as a building material. But we can use materials that are less likely to catch on fire. They recommend having covered vents, and so minimize the ability of a little flame or an ember that can kind of fly around and then flow into a vent and be inside of the ductwork within your house and potentially start a fire there. They're recommending that you have a fence or an outside building, that it's at a distance to the home, so that if that catches on fire, it's not going to be dragging the fire up into the house. And then they also recommend kind of clearing, the right monitor, clearing the land around it, so clear the vegetation. So again, you minimize the fuel and almost establish like the equivalent of a fire break around an area. So it makes it less likely that a fire would be able to advance across the ground and make it to the building. But then the question becomes, is that enough? Is that enough of a precaution or enough of an effort to protect property against these wildfires? And so if we take a look at this, right now, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, has flood insurance rate maps. And so they basically have gone through an area and then indicated the risk of a flood in that area. And so they're asking, basically what are the areas that are going to be flooded by kind of normal occurrences, and then what are the things that are going to be occurring more severely. And so they often talk about the 100-year flood. And so what a 100-year flood means is there's a 1% chance of a flood that extends to that region would occur in any given year. And ideally, that would mean that, statistically at random, it's only going to occur 1 out of 100 times. But then if the insurance companies use actuaries. It's a kind of advanced form of math that figures out the probability of events occurring. You run that, and so a individual building in an area of a 100-year flood has about a 1 in 4 chance of having that flood during their 30-year mortgage. And most people buy a house with a 30-year mortgage, and so that means then you're not quite flipping a coin. It's not like 1 or 2, but 1 chance out of 4 that you're going to be impacted by a flood. even if you're in an area where it's a chance of a 100-year flood, a 1 out of 100 chance that you're going to be looking at that. And so, for taking a look at insurance for fires right now, fire and smoke damage is usually covered under standard homeowners, renters policies. Usually business insurance won't cover that. Damage associated with water or putting out the fire that the firefighters would be doing is often covered as well. But individuals in areas of higher risk may have to pay higher premiums. That's what they have to do with flood insurance. So potentially, is this something that should be more standard for homeowners and business owners in developed areas that are close to or at risk to these fires? And then finally, should wildfire management, this is the final ethical dilemma in science for this topic, should wildfire management focus on reduction of carbon dioxide emissions? We've spent a lot of time talking about greenhouse gases. And so under normal circumstances, we would have biogenic CO2. That's a fancy way for saying bio is living, so it's basically living organisms generating carbon dioxide. Now, you and I are going to be creating biogenic carbon dioxide. We're going to be ingesting food, and as our bodies digest and use that food, we're going to be giving off carbon dioxide. And so that carbon dioxide is going to be going up into the atmosphere, and our friendly neighborhood plants are going to take in that carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis and convert that into, in essence, foods that we're going to eat directly or provide nutrients that something's going to eat in between the plant and us. And so an example of that would be like a burger. So you've got a beef cow or, like a steer kind of going through, big cow type creature, eating the grass, so eating the nutrients formed by photosynthesis, gets big and bulky, and then becomes a hamburger through various things, and we eat the food, the nutrients from the cow. We're actually eating the nutrients that are coming from the plant, and so that is kind of a natural kind of progression. But what we're seeing with the rise of industrialization is that we've also got these non-biogenic, non-living kind of production of carbon dioxide. It's often referred to as anthropogenic as well, so human-generated carbon dioxide. So taking a look at fossil fuels, burning those fossil fuels, generating a lot of carbon dioxide that's not within this natural cycle as we see it right now, just adding to kind of excess carbon dioxide within the atmosphere. And so if we take a look at this, and again, I gave you an example on the first slide where there's this thought that forest fires are releasing smoke and carbon, which is offsetting a lot of the emission effects that have been attempted. And so if we take a look at this, on this slide, we're looking at annual wildfire CO2 emissions, and we can see, 2020 was a bad year. This is kind of actually late 2020, this report was being generated. Lots of wildfires going here, but you can see, it's kind of periodic, but it seems to be getting larger, at least over this last period of 20 years. For the 2020 fire season, it was estimated that over 4 million acres of land burned, which released 112 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and that was initial efforts. And so that is roughly equivalent to about 24 million passenger cars driving with the kind of the normal what people would drive within the United States. So those forest fires in California in one fire season alone were the equivalent of 24.2 million cars driving down the road. And again, another problem with that, the bootleg fire in I think this was 2021, there was an area that was doing carbon offsetting. And so companies or individuals that wanted to reduce their carbon footprint would be able to support the planting of trees within this area, with the idea that the trees would take up the carbon dioxide as the trees grow. They would store the carbon dioxide and keep it out of the atmosphere. But now all of a sudden, a forest that's planted to pull in the carbon dioxide is now burning and giving off carbon dioxide. And so, something that we need to be aware of and consider. And so 3 different ideas, 3 different approaches to this concept of forest fires and wildfires. As always, a few references and a lot more, but try to cull this down to some key references that I thought were going to be valuable to include if you're interested in additional information. And this is both of these articles are available as free text over the internet. And so you can take a look at that, and again, looking at the importance of the indigenous cultures in managing their lands in a responsible stewardship model. As always, thank you for watching this Ethical Dilemma in Science. Hopefully you were able to get something beneficial out of it. Thank you, and have a great day.